Trump has been sort of ridiculed about a little bit has been Greenland.
The larger policy that the Trump administration is focused on right now is the interest that China has shown in being a near Arctic power. And the fact that they've built these major icebreakers. China's the top shipbuilding country in the world right now. The end goal, what we're really playing for in these elections, whether you're on the left or the right, is the prosperity and security of the next generation. Their ability to grow up in nations that are prosperous and secure, that aren't made deeply insecure by outlandish levels of debt that can't be paid back, or by reckless borrowing, or by baby boomers serving themselves at the expense of the next generation having economic opportunities.
David Legg was our first ever guest on Seize the Future and made quite an impression. For many viewers, that first episode is their favorite show. David is a phenomenal polymath and therefore able to connect multiple ideas into concrete strategies and insights in our often confusing world. Over the past year, David's joined the board of a large public oil and gas company in Canada and now advises the Liberal Party of Canada on discussions with the Trump administration, predominantly on tariff negotiations. David spoke at our annual summit this year in Zurich, and in this discussion, we dive deeper into many of the ideas that he discussed there. As always, David provides a unique and clarifying lens into the inner working of the highly complex geopolitical stage. David, welcome back. This is the first ever repeat guest of Seize the Future. So
All right.
super happy to have you here.
Great to be here.
Our first conversation was really inspiring, actually. A lot of people gave me some very strong feedback about it, and I think it's a lot of people's favorite show of Seize the Future. We covered a lot of very interesting ground. We'll try and do the same today. But before we do you want to maybe just give a quick update on what you've been doing for the last year? Because I think it's very relevant.
Sure. Well, you and I, when we first met, talked a lot about energy security and what had happened in Ukraine. And what was interesting about the election in the United States was that a lot of the elements of what we discussed actually became key parts of the debate in the U.S. And I think what you've seen since the election of President Trump and his team is that energy security is now a paramount part of the entire tariff and trade strategy. So since we last talked, I've actually joined the board of an energy company called Greenfire Resources. They're the 11th largest oil company in Canada right now, soon to be larger, we hope. It's a bit of a turnaround structure. And for me, that's the first time I've really been stuck in on the audit committee and sort of looking at energy assets up close and seeing what it takes to build a company like that and how subject those companies are, especially in open Western shareholder-led democracies, compared to competitors that operate in despotic states, often as state-backed assets with, state mandates that include security, not just being successful economically or commercially. So I've got a little more of that perspective now. And then I spent some time, we've had an election that just took place in Canada. We can talk about that.
Yeah.
And again, energy has become a key part of that election as well, because of course, after the president was elected, one of the first things that he said was that he was going to begin this tariff strategy. And Canada is deeply affected by tariffs, but the largest part of Canada's export GDP to the United States, which is 77% of our export GDP trade, and the largest trading partner with the states, the lion's share of that is actually energy assets. So some of what we talked about, became pertinent in the election, but certainly since then, in the debate between Canada and the United States, become a key part of the debate and discussion.
Yeah, you were at Trump's inauguration.
I was.
How was that?
It was great. I've got some good friends that are part of that administration. I had a chance to spend some time with some new people that I'd never met. The most fascinating discussion, we could talk about it, was about Greenland.
We definitely need to talk about that.
Okay.
But before we do, you mentioned despotic states, and actually we did have quite a segment on Iran, and actually that was one of the things that people gave a lot of feedback on in the last conversation.
Yeah.
And obviously things have changed dramatically with the Trump admin coming in with Iran.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe just give an update on your picture of Iran right here, right now? What's been going on?
Iran is on a very, very high wire act right now. They were implicated directly in what took place in Gaza October 7th. They are the state sponsor of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. And the Israelis have decimated Hezbollah and Hamas, and with American backing, the Americans have just decimated the Houthis and actually created a deal that was just cut in Oman last week with the Houthis. But if you remember, I guess it's now a couple months ago, the Israelis had a bombing run into Iran, and they eviscerated Iranian radar systems. And so Iran is actually wide open right now. And the Americans have come in and said, we are going to try and secure a deal where you give up entirely your nuclear program. And in exchange for that, we won't bomb you. So there's a completely different arrangement from the initial arrangement, which was the JCPOA arrangement under Obama, which was then being reinstituted by the Biden administration. And I think one of the things that happened under the Biden team is they ended up in a situation with the other Middle Eastern powers where they were told by Saudi Arabia and others that they needed to deal with the Houthis decisively. And they decided not to do that because they didn't want to derail the deal they were trying to reinstate with Iran, knowing that Iran had backed the Houthis. And the Middle East is an incredibly complicated chessboard in terms of cross-cutting affiliations and enemies and adversarial kind of historical relationships, to say the least. But I think what you've seen happen with the Trump administration is they came in and they have a very strong grip on how energy was used by Russia to cash itself up before it went into Ukraine, how the sanctions relief into Iran gave Iran an extra $200 billion they've then very promptly used to try and deploy their regional influence through these proxy terror groups, Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, but overstepped with what happened under Hamas, which was directed by the IRGC, and implicated themselves in ways that now are looking like there's going to be a reset. This is why I think Trump has decided to go to the Middle East instead of, as most U.S. presidents have done traditionally, gone to Canada as a first trip overseas. I think he's going to look for trade deals. He's already secured $1 trillion commitments. He's going to look for military deals as the area looks to deploy stronger security measures. And I think he's going to look to try and put pressure on Iran to close a deal. And I think he's going to use the Iranian discussion to put pressure on Russia with Ukraine. So incredibly complicated time, but it does kind of implicate a lot of the elements of the discussion we had previously on the role that energy is playing right now in this administration and in their strategy for projecting American soft power and hard power overseas.
So just talk about that for a second. You mentioned they're going to put pressure on Russia with their negotiation with Iran. So just explain what you mean by that, because I don't think many people will be aware of what perhaps is going to come down the line with Russia's involvement.
Yeah, so the American strategy in foreign affairs largely deals with 4 regional hegemons that they see as adversaries that have to be dealt with, but the strategies are very, very different. And all 4 of those regional hegemons have forged partnerships, tacit and then very explicit ones. And the most dangerous one that's been forged post the Ukraine invasion by Russia was between Russia and China. That alignment is something that has long been resisted by both countries. They don't completely trust each other. But in the face of American and NATO aggression, to use Russia's perspective of it, the Russians prepared after their invasion of Crimea in 2014, when they were under the initial sanctions regime. They prepared themselves for what they knew would be the sanctions regime that would take place if they invaded Ukraine in the east. So when they invaded Ukraine in the east, they immediately pivoted their energy supply out of Europe to China with some very large deals and a commitment to build a direct pipeline. They also intriguingly pivoted to India and have used India to sort of resupply Europe with laundered energy. But the effect had also been that China, which has a very close working relationship with Iran and with Venezuela, the two other sort of regional hegemons that the United States had been dealing with on energy terms, have now created sort of a very kind of tightly aligned group that allows the Americans, ironically, to use pressure on Iran and pressure on Russia to try and cut deals that both could benefit from. And I'll give you an example. There's a case to be made that because the Americans don't trust the Iranians with the development of their nuclear power to use it only for civilian purposes, that one of the outcomes of their dialogue with Russia over peace in Ukraine and their dialogue with Iran over giving up their nuclear weapons would be that Russia might be allowed to provide Iran with its civilian nuclear power as sort of a trusted third party, where Iran would permit them to operate, their nuclear facilities and deploy nuclear facilities inside Iran. But the Americans would get a reliable source of energy that would support the civilian population in Iran without allowing the Iranian regime to persist in making what they know is probably enriched uranium for weapons purposes. So it's an incredibly complicated chessboard. It's probably the most important set of interactions between energy, finance, terror, and regional hegemony. And in the middle of all that, you've got the number one adversarial relationship, which is being dealt with tariffs, rules around technology transfer, et cetera, which is the China-America nexus.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that America would go down the road of dealing with having Russia, who they clearly don't trust, provide nuclear power for Iran that they clearly don't trust.
Yeah.
As you say, it's an extremely complex chessboard. On the subject of complex chessboards, I think one thing that has obviously been the main focus of the Trump admin has been these tariffs.
Yeah.
And I think depending on what media you read these days, you could just be of the opinion that this is just a ridiculous Trump out of the deal type approach to things. There's more to it than that. Do you want to just maybe throw it? You've obviously been involved in some discussions with the Trump admin in your position in sort of advising parties in Canada. Do you want to maybe just talk through the way that you see things?
Yeah, look, I think it's the temptation to underestimate President Trump because he, just stylistically, the way he communicates on Twitter, his style, it's just very easy to disregard him or to feel that the things that he's saying or doing are just gratuitous sometimes. And sometimes he acts in a way that undermines the strategic objectives that he and his administration are pursuing.
Absolutely.
But I think that it's a mistake to allow whatever you find distasteful about him stylistically to misdirect understanding what it is that the United States is after strategically as a nation. It's important to keep in mind that an enormous amount of what you're seeing under any U.S. president, whether they're Democrat or Republican, is actually a deeply embedded national strategy that's existed before that president and will persist after that president. And a great example of this is the tariffs that President Trump brought in 2018, and a lot of the strategic initiatives that were brought in under President Trump in 2018 persisted under a Biden administration, which is probably, if you look at two administrations that are just completely ideologically opposed to each other, and after which the Biden administration went to great pains on dozens of different domestic policies, as the Trump team has now done with respect to the Biden administration, they just completely opposed each other in reverse. These what taken place under the predecessor, and yet in a whole series of different policies, they don't do that. And so when they don't do that, what it suggests is it's not just a President Trump policy or a Joe Biden policy. It's actually an American policy that a particular president chooses to deploy in a certain way, and the different personalities of these presidents will determine whether they're successful in deploying it or in deploying it in a manner that secures the support of other nations, et cetera. And I think with tariffs, what you're seeing is the Trump team is dealing with a fiscal reality, which is they spend $6 trillion a year. This is finger math, but they spend $6 trillion a year, but they only receive revenues of around just over four. And they have a $36.5 trillion debt. And so to bridge that $2 trillion, you've got several things happening at the same time. One is that they're going to attempt to use tariffs to raise, by JP Morgan's estimate, around $400 billion a year permanently going forward, and that by 2034 that will be sort of a $2 to $3 trillion achievement as these tariffs scale up. Some of them scale down. That's kind of the conservative math. So the tariffs do have a revenue angle to them. They're not simply a negotiating tactic. But the second thing about them is that they are a negotiating tactic, both for the removal of reciprocal tariffs, but also for the onshoring of manufacturing in a variety of very specific hand-picked industries. And the administration has attached a very direct strategy to every one of those industries. So some of those industries are industries that they believe they can nearshore or onshore critical supply chains. Others are industries that they believe have a dual use between security and economy. You see this in rare and critical minerals, rare earths, and chips and other things that have obvious economic benefit, but also have strategic military considerations. And you see that playing out a lot with respect to China. So if you do the finger math, what they're trying to do is use Doge to eventually get up to $1 trillion in savings to remove sort of half the problem of the $2 trillion gap, and then use tariffs to get half of the remaining half removed, and in the remaining half, achieve that through a series of growth measures. And we'll know that they've started to get to the point where they believe that they can achieve the remainder through growth measures when the president initiates a corporate tax cut, which is something he's been talking about, but right now wouldn't be affordable.
We'll talk about Canada in a minute, but before we do, another area, and you touched on it earlier, Trump has been sort of ridiculed about a little bit, has been Greenland. And I think it's very easy to look at that from afar and just be like, he's just a crazy idiot with a Twitter account. Why would anyone listen to anything he's doing? Again, tell us what's really happening here.
So this was actually the most interesting conversation when I was at the inauguration. Is actually a series of days where you go to different events, and depending on your ticket class, and I had a couple friends, so we went to the cabinet reception, which is a big event, and there are people walking around in ball gowns and suits, and I was in this little crowd of complete sort of geopolitical nerds, kind of huddled. I was there for 2 hours. And it was just mind-blowing to talk to people that had worked on the Greenland Strategy long before Donald Trump was president, And it's a reminder that this has been an American strategic concern for a long time. And I was unaware of what the assets they had in Greenland, or that they had attempted to buy Greenland twice in the past, back in the 1800s, early in the last century, and right now. And that they have 5 or 6 strategies for acquiring stronger territorial control over Greenland. And that there's a very specific set of strategies of how this will take place. So what I think happens, Richard, that people don't fully understand is the American president, there are probably 200 or 300 major policies like this that are just sitting in an archive vault, and there's people at State Department that are these types that speak 5 languages and are gifted, and they've been 30-year career civil servants and diplomats, and they're incredibly sharp, and they will be the person that is considered the person on that. And there'll be a team of 5 other people that are sort of around that, and even though they're working in Warsaw or they're working out in Japan or whatever, they'll be people that have been across that file. And so that file will probably be presented to the president, in a briefing as something that would be considered with respect to a larger policy. And the larger policy that the Trump administration is focused on right now is the interest that China has shown in being a near Arctic power, and the fact that they've built these major icebreakers. China's the top shipbuilding country in the world right now. The Russian incursion into the Arctic and the ability of Russia to traverse the Arctic and have the capacity to dominate in the Arctic over Canada, which shares the largest sort of undefended border with the United States, and is a NATO ally and a bilateral ally through NORAD. Greenland, if you sort of look at the Arctic from above, you see the Canadian, you see Alaska, Canada, Greenland dominate, and then the entire top of the Arctic, the other 45%, is Russia. And so the Arctic is considered on multiple levels to be a new critical form of potential global transit, almost equivalent, and they believe at some point it will be equivalent to the importance of the Panama Canal. And it's so important that China has been playing hardball to be a part of and if you look at it, you don't see China anywhere in that circumference, but they are working very closely with Russia and have actually been traversing and using their icebreakers to traverse. So the Americans have decided the Arctic is going to be a new front. And they already have a strong position in Greenland. If any of your listeners are really intrigued, check out Project Iceworm on Google. You can just Iceworm. You can just Google it, and it will show you these vast ice caves that the Americans built. It looks like a James Bond film set of these huge underground ice caverns that they had built out, and they've abandoned them now because the ice sheet shifted a little bit, and they were concerned over the sustainability of this as an underground base. But the Americans have been in Greenland. They have a base there now called Pacific, I think. It used to be called Thule. And this is increasingly going to become an important base for Arctic operations for the Americans. You'll see the Canadians put a base in the Arctic now coming out of this recent election. Both the Conservatives and Liberal Party agreed to do so. And I think that's going to be highly coordinated. But the American president, even though this president, again, tweets things, probably got briefed and just thought, this is fantastic, we're going to do it. And then went and tweeted and all hell broke loose. But their degree of seriousness over Greenland cannot be underestimated. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Greenland, which only has 56,000 people, ends up actually going through a process of determining whether they want to have more self-determination, because there's already a rule in place for that. And then given the different options the Americans have had for extraterritorial control that you see in places like the U.S. Virgin Islands or Saipan or Guam or Guantanamo, they have 4 or 5 different legal structures for having deeper territorial control. And they've walked me through a path that they think is plausible. And so it's a very serious thing.
So whether the Danes like it or not, Greenland will be shifting to the U.S.
Yeah, there's one strategy, which is a deal with the Danes. The Americans currently pay the Danes several $100 million a year because Greenland is Danish ceded territory. There's another strategy, which is there is a law passed in 2008 that allows Greenland greater self-determination if they vote to do that. They've made noises that they may do that. You notice J.D. Vance and his wife went on vacation in Greenland. Donald Trump Jr. went to Greenland. They're definitely putting a full court press and sending a lot of people there to think hard about how this will turn out. But no, it's not a mistake. It's not something that he did that's peripheral. It's something that has a deep kind of strategic layer to it.
Obviously, when you think about that Arctic focus, that's the reason, obviously, that he's been talking about Canada being the 51st state to some degree, I would imagine, at least part of it. So being a Canadian, maybe you can give us some insight into what's actually going on in Canada. You had this election. I think anyone who was an outside observer who'd watched, and you wrote an article actually on the lost decade under Trudeau. And I don't think anyone could have expected that the Liberal Party would have got into power again.
No.
And no matter what your politics, I mean, they really had, I think everyone can agree, done some serious damage to that country. And I think most Canadians would agree with that. But somehow they managed to get reelected. So what happened here?
Well, there's a lot of twists and turns in how that happened. Justin Trudeau in 2015 came in as a young, charismatic, very popular, sort of counter to, my team. I'm blue jersey, so I'm conservative, and someone I look up to a lot and respect a lot was Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who was replaced by Justin Trudeau in the Liberal Party. The reason I wrote the note, The Lost Decade, is because over 10 years, Canada, which is actually really an energy superpower, but is also deeply federalist structure. And as a result of its deep federalist structure, has a lot of regional antagonism, and some of it's embedded in traditional antagonism between the East and the West. And that antagonism showed up again, and it came up most prominently actually under Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, and there was a showdown between then Premier of Alberta, and the way that Canada is structured, Alberta actually owns the mineral rights and all the oil and gas in Alberta, and it's more oil than Russia and the United States and China combined. It is the single largest. I think there's only 4.5 million citizens of Alberta. It's probably the wealthiest democracy in the planet certainly on a per capita basis. And because it owns those assets and because its production of those assets creates so much wealth for Alberta and then for the rest of the country, there is kind of a natural imbalance in the way that Canada operates. And you've got very few people creating far and away most of the wealth that the country creates on a per capita basis, and then has transferred most of that wealth to the rest of the country. So Alberta, for instance, in the last 15 years has transferred more than $300 billion to the rest of Canada for Canada to actually function as a country. So in this decade, since 2015, the Liberal Party has seen almost every major metric, economic, social, cultural, decline significantly. And as a result, that's why I wrote The Lost Decade. And I won't go through all those metrics, but this election, if you had polled people and people had voted as they were polled back in early January, the Conservatives were ahead by more than 25 points. I mean, this was the largest gap in modern electoral history. So the idea that Conservatives would lose wasn't even on the table, even with the idea that they would replace someone as leader of the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
But you can't underestimate Donald Trump or the Conservative ability to make some self-defeating choices in how they manage the narrative around Donald Trump. And what the Liberal Party did effectively was change the ballot question from what was going to be a ballot question on carbon taxes and capital gains and other things to finding a new leader that was a very sort of staid, uncharismatic banker, a guy named Mark Carney, brought him in, and they turned the ballot question into who would be better to sit across the table from Donald Trump to talk about tariffs. Is it this old seasoned banker that looks like a conservative, talks like a conservative, aside from some green alarmism that's part of his party's heritage? Or is it this young upstart Pierre Poilievre guy? And what they did very effectively, the first step they did to reverse that ballot question was they immediately adopted the conservative position on carbon taxes. Ironically, because Mark Carney is one of the architects of the carbon tax, capital gains taxes, and a host of other things. So they took the conservative platform and owned it. And then they made the ballot question very much about Donald Trump and Donald Trump's jokes about the 51st state. And some say very sort of sincere interest in saying, what is the difference if Canada was effectively a colony of ours or not? Following his discussion with Justin Trudeau down at Mar-a-Lago, he just made the observation that if you can't make it economically without us, then why don't you just be the 51st state? And as with everything that this president does, he sort of has this negotiating tactic that he uses where he's quite extreme about things in order to put things into the news cycle, in order to drive his adversaries crazy and force their hand and make it about him. And he did that very effectively with this election. And the irony for the Conservatives, including me, was that we lost something that seemed eminently winnable. We ended up, the Liberals ended up with about 43% of the vote. We ended up with about 41%. We increased our seat count, but we lost. But, what the Liberal Party did very effectively is they sort of said, look, there's a crisis and we're the solution.
Yeah.
And the crisis is Donald Trump and his attempt to annex the country and his, economic war on us. And they presented themselves as sort of the solution that would come and secure people and be the state answer to Donald Trump. And conservatives don't do very well arguing that the government is the solution to anything. Yeah. And they especially don't do it very convincingly when it comes to comparing a bunch of conservatives, which tend to be free market, small government, like let's cut this government. That narrative didn't play as well when the liberals were able to create this crisis, national survival narrative. And you saw in the most recent election a week later down in Australia, a very similar strategy by the Labour Party, which is their left party, saying, look, it's all about affordability crisis. And that affordability crisis is tied to, the people shaping the new world order, which is Donald Trump and these conservatives, in that case, they call them the Liberal Party down there, look like they're going to be less capable than us at handling this crisis by creating big state solutions.
Could never be a responsible fiscal policy by the central bank.
Oh, well, as conservatives, we've got to get better at making the arguments that we want people to understand and believe, because it's very tough to watch us get rumbled in two elections in a row, both Canada and Australia, that we should have won. And I think that there's a lot of lessons in that. Really interestingly, Pierre Poilievre or his campaign chose not to be on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah, I think.
As you and I both know, podcasts are the only way to change people's minds and affect the future. So I don't, I think there were some unforced errors, but I don't want to bore anybody with domestic Canadian politics, but that's what happened.
I'd really be interested to understand how they ended up thinking that it was a good idea to avoid that. I mean, Poilievre is impressive when you hear him speak. He mentioned Australia had a very similar situation in that it's almost felt like they replicated to some degree what the Liberal Party in Canada did to completely flip an election. How much do you think these left-leaning governments globally are working together to get the outcomes they need?
Oh, 100%. There's free trade in campaign consultants, in ideas, in PR firms, and in the framing of these elections. I mean, you saw that was most obvious and I think egregious when the UK had 100 people come, including people who are actually in the UK government, come to support the Harris campaign.
I still don't quite understand how that's not election interference.
Well, these things have nuances to them, but I think the punchline as a conservative is we just have to get better at understanding how to reflect what these principles are. Look, the end goal, what we're really playing for in these elections, whether you're on the left or the right, is the prosperity and security of the next generation. Their ability to grow up in nations that are prosperous and secure, that aren't made deeply insecure by outlandish levels of debt that can't be paid back, or by reckless borrowing, or by baby boomers serving themselves at the expense of the next generation having economic opportunities. And I think the stakes are very, very high right now in the current sort of intergenerational moment with the addiction to debt of current governments and the way that they finance things they want right now at the expense of the next generation. Like, the intention can't be just that we pass this extraordinary intergenerational debt and just the sheer amount of money that it takes to service it every year to our kids as some kind of, heritage of an extreme selfish moment in politics. But this is happening across the West right now. I think it's got to be dealt with. But to deal with it, you've got to make very coherent arguments, because you're asking people basically to have a form of self-denial in order to do things for the next generation.
In a kind of scary way, it almost plays to the left's hand for things to be destabilized, to be in a bad way, because then you have nanny state come in and protect everybody and say, you're okay, you're going to get some benefits, we're going to look after you, here's a check.
Yeah, you saw it after the global financial crisis, which I think is one of the things that led to the creation of Bitcoin as a response. You saw it with COVID in particular, was extraordinary for the amount of government-backed misinformation of what was going on, but also the belief that you could just give people, huge quantums of government money to stay at home.
We have to talk about the fact that Alberta is in the process of potentially trying to separate from Canada. You did your PhD on Quebec separatism. Is that actually going to happen? I mean, as you said before, Alberta is such an important part of the economy. It basically pays for the rest of Canada. I mean, what would even happen to Canada if Alberta was to separate?
Look, I think there's 3 or 4 paths, but I think the best way to frame this conversation is the status quo in Canada is no longer tenable. But the way that you respond to that fact is going to be sort of determinative of what happens to the Canadian Federation. I left banking over in Asia to come back and help my friend Jason Kenney, who was former defense minister in Canada, get elected as premier of Alberta. And when I came back, I was struck by just how imbalanced the Canadian funding mechanism had become and the complete dependence on Alberta. But that was combined with deeply antagonistic policies federally against Alberta being able to move its resources to global markets because it's landlocked. And what had happened because of that was Alberta became more and more tied into the American energy supply chain, and it had to forfeit multiple different infrastructure projects that would have allowed Canada to trade its extraordinary energy resources overseas. And here's the irony. Canadian LNG is the single most powerful antidote to global emissions in China and India, where you've had the largest expansion of global emissions. You can get rid of more global emissions in China and India with Canadian LNG than the entire carbon footprint of Canada 3 times over, according to the National Bank economist. So all of the small ball initiatives that were being done in the name of greenhouse gas emissions domestically, which were not permitting pipelines and not permitting energy infrastructure, were actually working against the one thing that would have made the greatest difference in global emissions. So you've got these ironies that aren't just economically damaging to the country, but are also environmentally damaging if your real purpose was to remove global emissions. And what's happened over the last decade is that combination of geographic and political sentiment being so concentrated in the West in a conservative way, and the political sentiment and this sort of left activism, particularly the green alarmism, being so concentrated in the East, which has a larger population base, has started to exacerbate this tension. And the fact that the Liberal Party has been elected again on sort of a conservative platform means that for the first time, you have the 38 most important CEOs of all the energy firms and infrastructure firms saying, you have to do these 8 things if you're serious about creating a unified country and allowing our energy to get to global markets. You have the Premier of Alberta saying there are 4 things, and these are basically constitutional assertions. They're not demands holding the country hostage to some new form of economic leverage. This is just saying you have to honor the existing constitution with the following 4 things. But those are being laid down as criteria for the current prime minister and the governing party, the Liberal Party, federally. And that is actually creating a very different political culture in Canada, where the Premier of Alberta is the most important sort of counterpoint, I wouldn't say adversary, but counterpoint politically to the Prime Minister of the country. And in the background of all this is a US president saying, we're going to tariff everything in Canada 25%, but energy only 10%. And we really like Alberta, and we really like the idea of a 50%. So you've got a very unusual moment politically taking place. And right now, the polling in Alberta is between 1/4 and 1/3 of everyone in Alberta currently would opt for a completely different structure of the Federation, Alberta and the Federation. Doesn't mean you're going to be completely separate, but it could look a lot like Monaco in France. A state allows easy and free transit, but has a different code, different tax code, different structure, different sort of autonomous legal provisions. And I think that those debates are going to happen very intensely over the next 2 years.
Well, look, I've always loved Canada. I used to go there a lot as a kid, and I hope that even though the Liberal Party did get in, that they do make the moves towards the sort of the more sensible strategy. And that Canada can get itself back on the path to prosperity. And
me too.
Alberta is a core part of that. Before we wrap up, Two quick questions.
Sure.
One, you've got a 16-year-old son. So much is changing in the world. He's coming to a very critical age. What are you recommending to him to be focused on in terms of his career, the way that he should sort of be directing the North Star of his life? What advice do you have to teenagers today?
Wow, that's a tough question. I'll tell you what he and I have talked about. One thing is screen time and algorithms and the way that life is increasingly being driven online is terrible for these young guys. He's an incredibly capable young man, and he and his friends, you see these guys, being drawn into things. And I think we're going to look back at this moment. There's a great book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation, and he talks particularly about what's happened to little girls early on in social media and how devastating that is for their self-regard and personal development. Yeah. But he's also looked at what happens to boys and how it creates this state of suspended adolescence that continues into the 20s when they get wrapped up in gaming and other things, because the world's not an easy place. And you can now live in a virtual world and avoid a lot of the hard things that you actually need to face in order to become an adult and become successful. So one thing, is that he and I are talking a lot about how to live a life that's removed from this digital real interference, I think. One of the other things, this may sound counterintuitive because I know the right thing to say is you should study AI, but I actually think AI will be just fine on its own without my son studying it. I really want him to learn how to debate ideas, to think objectively for himself, to understand that, I like him to, we've started actually, this may sound odd, serious, but we started going to church together in the morning. I want him to listen to a sermon and see what he thinks, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. And we don't go all the time, but once every few weeks. I want him to think about what his teachers are saying and to critique it and understand that not everything that you hear, you should take at face value, even from people that you've grown up trusting as a kid, even for me. And so I think that in terms of a course of study, and this of course depends on your kid, he, like me, he would be useless as an engineer. But I want him to read literature. I want him to read about politics. I want him to read a lot of history. I want him to understand that the world is a complex and rough place, and to understand and empower himself in understanding how to reason through it and how to have respectful but important debates with people in order to develop what he really thinks. I think a lot of the things that we've talked about are often contrarian because people have just absorbed what they're told through a mainstream media lens that sometimes has its own commercial purposes or even its own political purposes. And it's not good that people aren't thinking for themselves or reading for themselves or understanding things.
Phenomenal advice. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Question, always. Last year you told us modular nuclear, ag tech, Canadian oil and gas, obviously. Where are you allocating capital? Any differently?
Well, this is so dangerous. I feel like I'm an amateur. I'm in Switzerland at C's Capital, telling you guys how to think about it. I mean, you and I both believe that Bitcoin is a structural investment that everybody should have some of. Mm-hmm. I think that has proven to be the case. I think that I'm still very big on conventional energy, although I do think that the Trump administration is committed to getting oil down to $50 a barrel, and I think they're doing that for a lot of reasons we can talk about another time. But I think that you should temper your investment in conventional energy to that reality. Mm-hmm. You and I had a debate offline about hard assets like real estate and housing. You've given me a lot to think about on that front. But I think that small modular nuclear, if you're interested in energy, I think there's 4 or 5 emerging technologies that are going to become quite powerful. The reason I like small modular nuclear, and I'm exposed to quantum computing right now, which is an area that I think holds a lot of promise, but I'd probably put quantum computing and small modular nuclear on a similar time frame, which is pretty far out. So, invest at your risk. But I think that both those things are, in a similar way to Bitcoin, part of the architecture of the future. that would provide, in nuclear's case, very persistent, very stable baseload power, unlike renewables, that is completely carbon zero, is exportable to poor countries and helps deal with energy insecurity. So that remains at the top of my list, and I'm tempering a little bit, advising conventional energy.
Great.
Yeah.
Good. David, thanks so much. This has been great, always. We could have talked for hours.
Yeah, I love it. I love coming here.
But yeah, we'll do it again.
Okay. Look forward to it.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.